What did 10th century BC Afghanistan and 6th century BC China and 1st century BC Judea have in common? They were all undergoing significant social and cultural upheaval. And what each of these civilizations independently came to understand was that in order to live together in harmony, they needed to consider the needs of their neighbor. And so Zoroaster wrote, "The nature of good is that which refrains from doing unto another whatsoever is not good for you." And Confucius wrote, "Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself." And Rabbi Hillel wrote, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." Anything sound familiar here? So when I was in high school, my hometown was undergoing its own kind of social and cultural upheaval. There was a large influx of Cambodian families that had been relocated by the U.S. government in Rochester, Minnesota. Wow, cold. I remember these new kids in school. They were smaller than the big hulking Minnesota kids. They didn't speak English. They carried all of their books around with them in their backpacks, and they never took off their super heavy, bulky winter coats. And boy, did they work hard. I'll never forget sitting in history class and glancing over at one of these students' textbooks, and every single word in that book was translated from English into Cambodian. And not only did they have to study like everybody else, but they had to work twice as hard to just reach the place where I started. And that's on top of the work they did outside of school. I would see them behind the counter at Taco John's or Burger King. Now, there's a bully in my school. There's probably a bunch. But there was one in particular named Troy. And Troy was a guy who hung out with a group we called the Burnouts. And he was a tough kid. And it never occurred to me to wonder why he was such a tough kid. Needless to say, he and I ran around in very different social circles, and our paths rarely crossed in this very big high school. But they did one day in the hall when I encountered him picking on a Cambodian student. And I stepped in and I told him to cut it out. And I told him to quit being a jerk. And in that moment, I stepped into the lineage of my forebears, Zoroaster, Confucius, and Hillel. Because quit being a jerk was the high school equivalent to imposing harmony in a time of social and cultural upheaval by enforcing the injunction, do not do what is hateful to your neighbor. And Troy backed off until I am sure he encountered that Cambodian kid again when I wasn't around. Because the injunction by our forebears to care for our neighbors while right wasn't quite enough. History makes the point. The moral imperative to not be a jerk is built upon a power posture, defined by the negative we hear in the injunctions themselves: not good, do not hateful. These are directives underwritten by a social hierarchy. Zoroaster, Confucius, and Hillel sat atop the social hierarchies of their culture. It was the hierarchy, not the rightness of doing good, that stopped Troy. And it also kept him from punching me out. But the second that hierarchy flips, the injunction to care for one's neighbor crumbles. History shows us what the consequences look like. Tons of examples. Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, France under the Reign of Terror, China in the Great Leap Forward, even England under Cromwell. No question, on that day, Troy would have sent me to the guillotine were it an option. Because history teaches us that for the injunction to care for one's neighbor to work, to really work, the system needs to be bigger than the human hierarchy upon which it sits. And that's the point we hear in the gospel today. That's the point that Jesus makes. Jesus does something super interesting. He takes two different ideas and he hitches them together. Two ideas that he pulls from the wisdom of Judaism. One comes from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, which is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might." Deuteronomy 6:4. And he hitches that to Leviticus 19:18, which is, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." He puts them together. And in doing this, Jesus sets God at the center of the injunction to care for neighbor, and then binds that care to the very nature of God, which the Bible tells us is love. Love your neighbor as yourself. So why love your neighbor as yourself? Because God is. Because it matters to God. Because that is how God designed the system. The connective tissue is God. The connective tissue is love. God is love. You with me? Like sometimes this simple idea gets very confused in the minds of men. Recently, a politician who claims a Catholic orientation sought to define neighbor by citing an ancient Roman Catholic doctrine known as Ordo Amoris. And that doctrine sets neighborliness within a hierarchy based on these concentric circles, starting with the nuclear family, and then going to the neighbor, and then going to the city, and then going to the state possibly, and then going to the nation, and then to anybody else maybe. Now, Pope Francis, who's also Catholic, turns out, big time Catholic, right? He quickly jumped into that conversation to provide a corrective, citing the story of the Good Samaritan as the defining framework for who our neighbor is. Who is that neighbor? The one you meet in greatest need. The one in greatest need. That included the Cambodian kid in the hallway. But it also, and this is the point I completely missed, it also included Troy, right? His plight, his pain, his dignity. You see, in times of upheaval, it is critically important that we seek to see the world through the Jesus lens, right? And the Jesus lens included Troy, because no one is outside the love of God. If we find ourselves in an age when upheaval seems to have flipped the hierarchy and retribution rears its ugly head, we must remember there is a God, that we must stand up for those in need, and that Troy is also suffering. Now, there are plenty of smart, insightful people of who late have pointed to the problems that have caused this social and cultural upheaval. Cited many things. They've cited the epidemic of loneliness, the polarization of politics, and quite rightly, the inequality of opportunity. We have smart people today, just as there were smart people in 10th century Afghanistan, and in 6th century China, and in 1st century Judea. We have people in our community today, right now, here in Seattle, building organizations to confront these problems. Some are oriented towards teaching civics. Others seek to welcome people more fully into the city. Some facilitate conversations across political divides. And all of this stuff, this is good. It's good, but it will fail over time without love at the center. And not any love, But the love that Jesus is talking about in the gospel, agape love, the love of God, the love that is God, a love that cannot exist if there is no God. If we have no God, then the center can't hold, as Lex reminded us in his sermon 2 Sundays back. It didn't hold in Afghanistan, did not hold in China, it did not hold in first century Judea. The love of God is the point, it is the purpose, and it is the process. And we must make that point, we must share that purpose, and we must live out that process. We must love our neighbor as ourselves because there is a God. So many years ago, there were 2 people in that hallway, but I only cared for one of them, and God was not part of the consideration. It was all about personal power and the capacity to leverage social status. But as Mother Teresa reminds us, it is love, only love, that is going to save the world. Resurrection punctuates the point. Resurrection is God rejecting human rejection without denying human freedom. That's resurrection. God denying human rejection without rejecting human freedom. Because God is love. And there is no love if there is no freedom to be a jerk. Which was the freedom that Troy was exercising. And it's the freedom that I was exercising as well. And I'm pretty sure that under his breath, Troy called me a jerk. There's a better way. Love is a stronger force. And while it may require that we turn the other cheek, it also means that we never leave the hallway, ever, when someone is in need. That's why Jesus came, after all, to make that point. He came to remind humanity how much they love God and that there is a God and that God is present. And Jesus never left the room. He was dragged from the Garden of Gethsemane. He was beaten in the basement of the high priest's house. He was ridiculed at the feet of a petty tyrant, a silly small man. And then he was forced to carry his own cross. But he never ran. He could have. Make no mistake about it, he could have ran. Jesus never left the room. He never capitulated. He was never afraid because he understood love. Love is the courage to engage in the mess of upheaval. Jesus lived his catchphrase, "Do not be afraid." And then he showed us why. Resurrection. Resurrection is the victory of love. It is the promise of love. It's the reality that love always wins, even over the inevitability of death. Love is knowing the bad thing is never the last thing. We know this because we're people of the resurrection. We know this because we're Jesus people. Here at Epiphany, we practice that resurrection love. That's what we do. It's the perfect venue for doing so because here we gather with everyone in the entire world. Because everyone is included here. Everyone is welcome. If you are alive, you are a beloved child of God. Full stop. Everyone is our neighbor equally. Our spouse, family, guy who lives next door, complete stranger, somebody on the other side of the world, the bully from high school. Now, I could have met Troy as a brother and appealed to the goodness God created within him. I could have met him beyond the hierarchy of culture as a sibling in the kingdom of God, where God is the center. Knowing that the only way resolution will hold, the only way, is through love, agape love, the love of God, the love exercised by the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? It's the one I meet in the hallway. And so if you want the world to be a better place, if you want to push back against what you may perceive as a social and cultural upheaval, then tell someone about the God you believe in. Do not be afraid. Do not shrink back. Even if you think the Christian brand has become sullied or is toxic, don't worry, because God does not have a brand. Because God does not need a new marketing plan. Because God is bigger than that. God is love. It is a love made known by Jesus, a love articulated when he said, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," because the Lord is God. The Lord alone. God is at the center. God is love. It is love. It is love and love alone that will return us to the fullness of God's design. It is love that will save the world.